The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, as Kane Zimmerman rode his weary horse down the familiar dusty trail that led to Truckee, Nevada. 5 years had passed since he'd left this place with a bounty on his head and hatred in his heart, but the mountain still stood tall and proud against the darkening sky, unchanged by time or the bitterness of men. His hand instinctively moved to the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the night the town had turned against him. It was 1879, and the West was changing. The railroad had brought progress to many frontier towns, including Truckee, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Kane had once been the town's respected deputy, until the night everything changed. False accusations, a crooked judge, and the greed of powerful men had branded him a thief and a murderer. Only his quick thinking and quicker draw had kept him from swinging at the end of a rope. As he approached the town limits, memories flooded back, both the good and the terrible. Among those memories was a face he'd never been able to forget, Clara Thompson, with her honey-colored hair and eyes that reminded him of a summer sky. They had planned to marry before his world collapsed. He had told her to forget him, to build a new life. Surely she had done just that. The wooden sign welcoming travelers to Truckee came into view. Kane pulled his hat lower over his eyes and nudged his horse forward. The town had grown since he'd been gone. New buildings lined Main Street, and the distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the valley. He wasn't here for revenge, though the thought had consumed him during his first years away. No, he was here because he had finally found evidence to clear his name, evidence that pointed to the town's most respected citizen, Mayor Harrison Wells. Kane guided his horse toward the livery stable, planning to secure lodging before nightfall. As he rode, he noticed how people stopped to stare. Some faces he recognized, others were strangers, but all shared the same expression of shock and unease. Word would spread quickly. The dead man had returned. After stabling his horse, Kane made his way to the Riverside Inn, a modest establishment at the edge of town. He secured a room from the wide-eyed proprietor, who clearly recognized him, but was too stunned to refuse his business. After washing away the dust from his journey, Kane stood at the window of his room, looking out over the town that had once been his home. The Truckee River flowed on the outskirts of town, its waters catching the last golden rays of sunlight. Something drew his gaze to the riverbank, a solitary figure standing near the water's edge. Even from this distance, something about the woman's posture was hauntingly familiar. He watched as she seemed to cast something into the water, a daily ritual, perhaps, before turning to walk back toward town. His heart quickened as recognition dawned. It couldn't be. After all this time, it couldn't possibly be her. Yet something pulled him forward, out of the room and down the stairs, his spurs jingling with each urgent step. He had to know. By the time Kane reached the riverbank, the sun had set, and twilight was settling over the land. The woman was still there, her back to him as she gazed out over the water. Her dress was simple, her hair now streaked with premature strands of silver pulled back in a practical knot. Yet he would have known her anywhere. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, as if she'd been expecting him, as if she'd heard his voice calling to her in dreams 1,000 times before. When her eyes met his, time seemed to stand still. "Kane," she breathed, neither smiling nor frowning. "I knew you'd come back someday." The years fell away as they stared at each other. She was older now, her once smooth face bearing fine lines around her eyes and mouth. But she was still beautiful, perhaps more so, with the quiet dignity that she now carried. "You're still here," he said, unable to hide his disbelief. "After everything that happened." Clara nodded, her hands clutching something small and worn. I never believed what they said about you, not for a single day. Kane took a step forward, careful, as if she might disappear like morning mist. I told you to forget me, to find someone who could give you a proper life. A sad smile crossed her face, and I chose not to listen. Some stubborn habits never change. She looked down at the object in her hand, a small, smooth river stone. Every day at sunset, I come here and toss a stone into the water. One for each day you've been gone. I promised myself I would stop only when you returned or when you knew I was dead. Kane finished for her, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, then added with quiet defiance, I'm not finished waiting yet. Kane's throat tightened. 5 years. Nearly 2,000 sunsets. 2,000 stones cast into the flowing river with unwavering faith. He had survived on hatred, on the burning desire to clear his name and expose those who had framed him. But Clara had survived on hope. I found evidence, Clara. Papers that prove Wells and Judge Parker conspired to frame me for the bank robbery. That they were the ones who murdered the bank manager when he discovered their embezzlement scheme. Her eyes widened. You came back to clear your name. I came back for justice, he corrected, then added more softly, but seeing you here, I realized there might be more to come back for than I thought. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees along the riverbank. In the distance, the lights of Truckee winked on one by one. They won't welcome you, Clara warned. Wells has only grown more powerful. He owns half the businesses in town now, including the new hotel near the station. I didn't expect a welcome, Kane replied, his hand unconsciously touching the gun at his hip. But I won't run anymore. Not from him, not from lies. Clara studied his face, noting the hardness that hadn't been there before, the weariness in his eyes. Where have you been all this time? Everywhere and nowhere. Wyoming, Montana, even up to the Canadian border. Took work where I could find it, ranch hand, bounty hunter, security for mining operations. He paused. I never stayed anywhere long, never let myself get comfortable. And now you're back, walking into the lion's den. Kane smiled, though there was little humor in it. Wells isn't a lion, Clara. He's a snake, and it's time someone cut off his head. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender scent she'd always favored. I have information too, Kane. Things I've observed, conversations I've overheard. Wells doesn't know I've been paying attention all these years. For the first time since returning, Kane felt a flicker of something other than determination or bitterness. It felt dangerously like hope. We should talk somewhere private, he suggested, glancing toward town where lights now glowed in windows. Someone's bound to have recognized me by now. Clara nodded. My father passed 2 winters ago. I live in his house now on the edge of town. It's quiet and neighbors mind their own business. They walked side by side, not touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. The years between them were filled with unspoken words, with dreams deferred and hearts that had never truly moved on. Clara's home was a modest cabin with a small porch and neatly tended garden. Inside, it was warm and inviting, with simple furniture and handmade quilts. A far cry from the places Kane had laid his head these past years. She busied herself making coffee while Kane removed his hat and coat, revealing the lean, hardened physique of a man who had lived rough. When she handed him the steaming mug, their fingers brushed and both pretended not to notice the jolt that passed between them. Tell me everything, she said, settling into a chair across from him. And so he did. He told her about fleeing Truckee with a bullet in his shoulder, about the kind stranger who had tended his wounds in a remote cabin. He spoke of the years spent moving from place to place, taking odd jobs and keeping his head down. And finally, About meeting a dying man in a Montana saloon, Wells' former business partner, who had been forced out years ago and had carried the secret of the bank robbery all this time. He gave me letters, Kane explained. Correspondence between Wells and Judge Parker, planning the robbery and discussing how to frame me if anything went wrong. The original plan was just to take the money, but when the bank manager caught them in the act, they killed him and put the blame on you, Clara finished. But why you specifically? Kane's expression darkened. Because I was investigating discrepancies in the town's finances. As deputy, I reported directly to Sheriff Turner, but he was too close to retirement to want to rock the boat. I was getting too close to their scheme. Clara sipped her coffee, her brow furrowed in thought. Sheriff Turner died last year. His replacement is a man named Dawson. He's Wells' puppet through and through. And Judge Parker, still presiding, still in Wells' pocket. She set down her mug. But Kane, there's something else you should know. Wells is planning something big. There's been talk about forcing small ranchers to sell their land, something about a new railroad spur coming through. Kane leaned forward. He's buying up property. Or taking it when people can't pay suddenly increased taxes or when their water rights mysteriously come into question. Clara's eyes flashed with anger. My father fought him until the end. After he died, Wells tried to pressure me to sell too, but I refused. Has he threatened you? Kane asked sharply. Clara hesitated. Not directly, but there have been incidents. A fire in my storage shed, livestock that went missing. Nothing I could prove was his doing. Kane's jaw tightened. He'd come back for his own redemption, but hearing that Clara had been facing battles of her own ignited a protective fury he thought he'd buried long ago. Tomorrow, I'll take the evidence to the territorial marshal's office in Carson City, he said. Wells and Parker need to answer to someone outside their sphere of influence. Clara reached across the table and laid her hand on his arm, the first deliberate touch between them. Her skin was warm against his, and he fought the urge to capture her hand in his own. Carson City is a day's ride and word travels fast, she said. If Wells gets wind that you're back and heading to the marshal. What choice do I have? Kane asked. I can't take on the whole town alone. Clara's eyes held his, steady and determined. You're not alone anymore, Kane. You never were. In that moment, looking into her eyes by the warm glow of lamplight, Kane realized that part of him had never left this town, never left this woman. That despite all his efforts to harden his heart, to focus only on clearing his name, there had always been this quiet, persistent hope that he would find her waiting. As if reading his thoughts, Clara squeezed his arm gently before withdrawing her hand. You should stay here tonight. It's safer than the inn where everyone knows you've returned. Kane knew he should refuse, should maintain the distance that years and circumstance had put between them. But he was tired of running, tired of being alone. Thank you, he said simply. She showed him to a small spare room, providing fresh linens and a towel. The domesticity of it all was almost overwhelming after years of transient living. Before leaving him to settle in, Clara paused at the door. I never stopped believing in you, Kane. Not once in 5 years. He wanted to tell her that her faith had been misplaced, that he wasn't the same man who had left. That the years had changed him, hardened him in ways she couldn't understand. Instead, he found himself saying, I never stopped thinking about you, Clara, even when I told myself I should. She smiled, then a real smile that reached her eyes and momentarily erased the worry lines from her face. Get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. After she left, Kane sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. Coming back to Truckee had been about justice, about clearing his name. He hadn't expected to find Clara still here, still believing in him, still waiting. It complicated everything, yet somehow made his purpose clearer than ever. He was no longer fighting just for his own redemption. He was fighting for a future he had never allowed himself to imagine might still be possible. Morning came with the soft sounds of Clara moving about the kitchen. Kane had slept better than he had in years, despite the weight of what lay ahead. He dressed quickly, checking his gun before holstering it beneath his coat. The evidence was secure in an inside pocket, close to his heart. Clara had breakfast waiting, fresh bread, eggs, and coffee that reminded him of simpler times. They ate mostly in silence, both aware that the day ahead could change everything. "I've been thinking," Clara said finally. "Before you ride to Carson City, we should speak with Reverend Adams. He's never believed the accusations against you, and he has influence with people who might help." Kane considered this. Adams was always a fair man, but involving him puts him at risk. He would want to help, Clara insisted, and his church provides neutral ground. Wells wouldn't dare move against you there. After some discussion, they agreed it was worth the risk. They would visit the Reverend after the morning service, when the church would be empty. In the meantime, Kane needed to check on his horse and gather the few belongings he'd left at the inn. "Be careful," Clara cautioned as he prepared to leave. "Wells has eyes everywhere." Kane nodded, adjusting his hat. "I've survived 5 years with a price on my head. I can manage a few hours in Truckee." His tone softened. "But thank you for caring." "Old habits," she replied with a small smile. The morning was bright and clear as Kane made his way back into town. Sunday meant most businesses were closed, with townspeople either at church or enjoying their day of rest. Still, he felt eyes on him as he walked, heard the whispers that followed in his wake. At the livery stable, the young attendant, a boy who couldn't have been more than 15, stared at him with undisguised awe. "You're him, ain't you? Kane Zimmerman. My pa told me about you." Kane regarded the boy carefully. "And what did your pa say?" "That you were the fastest draw in Nevada before." The boy trailed off, uncertain. "Before I supposedly robbed a bank and murdered a man," Kane finished dryly. The boy shrugged. "Pa said there was always something fishy about that story, said you weren't the type." Kane was surprised by this small nugget of support from an unexpected quarter. "What's your name, son?" "Timothy, sir. Timothy Miller." "Well, Timothy Miller, I'd appreciate it if you'd take extra good care of my horse today. I might need him in a hurry." The boy nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir, Mr. Zimmerman." After ensuring his horse was well tended and retrieving his saddlebags from the inn where the proprietor nervously avoided his gaze, Kane decided to walk past the sheriff's office. Knowledge was power, and he needed to gauge how quickly word of his return was spreading. The sheriff's office was quiet, but as Kane passed by, the door opened and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Dawson, presumably. Their eyes met, and Kane saw recognition dawn on the man's face. Neither spoke as Kane continued walking, but he could feel the sheriff's gaze boring into his back. The message was clear. His presence had been officially noted. By the time Kane returned to Clara's house, church services would be ending. They had agreed to meet at the church afterward, approaching separately to avoid drawing attention. As Kane made his way there, he couldn't help noticing how much Truckee had grown. New businesses lined Main Street, and construction was underway on what appeared to be a grand hotel near the train station. Wells' prosperity was on full display. The white-steepled church stood on a small hill overlooking the town. Kane waited in a stand of trees nearby, watching as parishioners filed out after the service. He recognized many faces, older now, but still familiar. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly, who had later stood by as he was accused and nearly lynched. He spotted Clara among them, exchanging pleasantries with an elderly couple. She looked different in her Sunday best, a blue dress that matched her eyes and a small hat with a ribbon. She carried herself with dignity, nodding and smiling at appropriate moments while discreetly scanning the surroundings. When her eyes found him among the trees, she gave no sign of recognition, but shortly thereafter made her excuses and remained behind as others departed. Kane waited until the churchyard was empty before approaching the building. He entered through a side door as they had arranged, finding Clara and Reverend Adams waiting in the small study adjacent to the sanctuary. The Reverend was older than Kane remembered, his hair now completely white, but his eyes were as kind and perceptive as ever. He extended his hand without hesitation. "Kane Zimmerman, the Lord works in mysterious ways. I've prayed for your safe return, though I confess I doubted I would live to see it." Kane shook the offered hand. "Reverend Adams, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. Miss Thompson has explained some of your situation," the Reverend said, gesturing for them to sit. "She says you have evidence that could clear your name. Evidence that will implicate Mayor Wells and Judge Parker," Kane confirmed, producing the letters from his coat. "These prove they orchestrated the bank robbery and framed me when their plan went awry." Reverend Adams read through the correspondence carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is disturbing indeed. If authentic, these letters are damning." "They're authentic," Kane assured him. "Wells' former partner provided them on his deathbed. He had kept them as insurance." "The question remains, how do we proceed?" the Reverend asked. "Wells holds considerable influence, even beyond Truckee. The territorial marshal in Carson City is likely to listen, but getting there safely is another matter." "That's why we came to you," Clara explained. "We need allies, people who might help ensure Kane reaches Carson City with this evidence." Reverend Adams nodded thoughtfully. "There are those in town who have questioned Wells' methods, particularly regarding the pressure on small landowners. Elijah Morgan, for one. His freight business has suffered since refusing to transport lumber from Wells' newly acquired timberland. Morgan was always an honest man," Kane recalled. "And Samuel Green at the newspaper," Clara added. "He's printed veiled criticisms of Wells' business practices. Nothing direct enough to cause trouble, but enough to show where his sympathies lie. A small coalition, but perhaps enough to help navigate this situation," the Reverend agreed. "I can arrange a discreet meeting this evening. My home would be suitable. Wells rarely concerns himself with my activities." As they finalized plans for the evening meeting, the church door opened suddenly. All three turned to see Sheriff Dawson standing in the doorway, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Well, well. Quite the reunion," Dawson drawled. "Zimmerman, you've got nerve showing your face in Truckee after what you did." Kane stood slowly, careful to keep his hands visible. "I've done nothing wrong, Sheriff. Can't say the same for your employer." Dawson's eyes narrowed. "You're still a wanted man in these parts. I'd be within my rights to arrest you on the spot." "This is a house of God, Sheriff," Reverend Adams said firmly, stepping forward. "I would prefer if you respected its sanctity." "With all due respect, Reverend, harboring a fugitive is against the law, even for a man of the cloth." Dawson's gaze shifted to Clara. "Miss Thompson, I'm surprised at you. Your father was a respected member of this community." "My father believed in justice, Sheriff," Clara replied evenly. "He never accepted the lies told about Kane, and neither do I." Tension filled the small study as Dawson seemed to consider his options. Finally, he took a step back. "I'll give you until sundown to leave town, Zimmerman. After that, I'll have deputies posted on every road out of Truckee." After the sheriff left, the three exchanged grim looks. Their timetable had just been dramatically accelerated. "He'll report directly to Wells," Kane said. "We need to move now, not wait for tonight." "Morgan's freight yard is closest," Clara suggested. "If he's willing to help, he could get you out of town in one of his wagons." "Both of you should stay here," Kane insisted. "I've brought enough trouble to your doorsteps." Clara's expression hardened with determination. "We're past that point, Kane. We're in this together now." Reverend Adams nodded in agreement. "Miss Thompson is right. Moreover, her presence may help persuade Morgan. They've been neighbors for years." With little time to argue, Kane reluctantly agreed. They left the church cautiously, taking a circuitous route through back alleys to avoid being seen together. Morgan's freight yard was located at the eastern edge of town, a collection of warehouses and wagon bays adjacent to a modest office. They found Elijah Morgan reviewing ledgers at his desk, his reading spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up in surprise as they entered, recognition and then shock crossing his weathered face as he saw Kane. "Good Lord above," he exclaimed, standing quickly. "Kane Zimmerman. Never thought I'd see you again in this life." "Mr. Morgan," Kane acknowledged with a nod. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we're in a difficult situation." As succinctly as possible, they explained the circumstances. Morgan listened intently, his initial surprise giving way to thoughtful consideration. When shown the incriminating letters, he whistled low. "I always suspected Wells was crooked, but this—" He shook his head in disgust. "Framing an innocent man for murder. That's beyond corruption, that's evil." "Sheriff Dawson has given Kane until sundown to leave town," Clara explained. "But we believe he'll act sooner on Wells' orders." Morgan stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I've got a wagon leaving for Carson City within the hour. Furniture deliveries. You could hide among the cargo." "Wells' men might search departing wagons," Kane pointed out. "True enough," Morgan conceded. "But I've been shipping goods in these mountains for 20 years. I know every back trail and cattle path between here and Carson City." He smiled grimly. "Some routes don't appear on any map." As they discussed details, a young man burst into the office, Morgan's son James, breathless with urgency. "Pa, sheriff's deputized a dozen men. They're searching for Zimmerman house to house. Heard them say they're coming here next." Morgan moved quickly to the window, peering out at the street. "No time for careful planning. James, hitch up the small wagon, the one with the false bottom we use for delicate shipments. Kane, you'll have to hide there until we're clear of town." Clara turned to Kane, her eyes filled with worry. "I should come with you." Kane shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. Stay here, tell Green at the newspaper what's happening if I don't make it to Carson City." "Don't say that," she interrupted. "If I don't," he continued gently, "the story needs to be told. The truth needs to come out." Morgan interrupted their exchange. "There's no time for debate. James has the wagon ready, but we need to move now." Kane hesitated only a moment before pulling Clara into a quick embrace. "I'll come back," he promised against her hair. "This time I'll come back." She pulled away first, blinking back tears. "I'll hold you to that, Kane Zimmerman." Morgan led Kane to a small, covered wagon where his son had created a hiding space beneath the floorboards. It was cramped and dark, but it would have to do. As Kane lowered himself into the space, Morgan handed him a loaded pistol. "Just in case," the older man said grimly. The next hour was the longest of Kane's life, lying in darkness as the wagon jolted along Truckee streets. He heard voices as they were stopped at the town's edge, Dawson's men questioning Morgan, who played the role of irritated businessman to perfection. There was a tense moment when someone suggested searching the wagon, but Morgan's reputation and indignation apparently carried the day. Once clear of town, They traveled several miles before Morgan signaled it was safe for Kane to emerge from hiding. As he climbed out, stiff and disoriented, Kane saw they were on a narrow trail winding through dense forest, clearly not the main road to Carson City. "We'll stick to the back routes," Morgan explained as Kane joined him on the driver's bench. "Add a few hours to the journey, but we'll avoid any patrols Wells might have set up." "I owe you more than I can repay," Kane said sincerely. Morgan shook his head. "You owe me nothing. Wells has been squeezing small businesses like mine for years. If these letters help bring him down, that's payment enough." As they traveled, Morgan filled Kane in on 5 years of Truckee history, how Wells had consolidated power, how Judge Parker had ruled consistently in favor of the mayor's interests, how dissenters had been systematically pressured or driven out of town. "And Clara?" Kane asked hesitantly. "How has she managed to stand against him all this time?" Morgan gave him a knowing look. "That woman has a spine of steel under her gentle exterior. When her father died, Wells assumed she'd sell the property immediately. When she refused, he tried charm, then pressure, then intimidation. Nothing worked. She mentioned incidents of fire, missing livestock." Morgan nodded grimly. "Just the tip of the iceberg. There was also the time her well was mysteriously contaminated, and when the bank suddenly lost records of her mortgage payments." He glanced sideways at Kane. "She never wavered, though. Some folks said she was being stubborn for no reason, holding on to property too big for a single woman. But those who knew her better understood." "Understood what?" Kane asked, though something in him already knew the answer. "That she was waiting. That she believed you'd come back someday, and she wanted to have a home to offer when you did." Morgan smiled slightly. "Quite a woman, that Clara Thompson." Kane fell silent, absorbing this. He had spent 5 years trying to forget Clara, telling himself that she had moved on, that it was better that way. The realization that she had endured hardship and pressure, maintaining her faith in him all this time, was almost too much to bear. They traveled through the day and into the evening, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal from Morgan's provisions. The mountain trails were rough but passable, and Morgan navigated them with the confidence of long experience. By nightfall, they had covered substantial ground, though Carson City was still several hours away. "We'll push on," Morgan decided after consulting the stars. "Better to arrive in the small hours than risk being caught on the road tomorrow." Kane agreed, taking a turn at the reins to allow Morgan some rest. As his companion dozed, Kane found himself thinking of Clara, wondering what she was doing at that moment. Was she safe? Had Wells' men questioned her about his whereabouts? The urge to turn back, to ensure her safety, was almost overwhelming, but he knew the best protection he could offer was completing his mission. They reached Carson City just before dawn, the streets quiet and empty as Morgan guided the wagon to the territorial marshal's office. It was still too early for the office to be open, but Morgan knew of a nearby boarding house where the marshal, James Calloway, took his breakfast each morning. "We'll wait there," Morgan suggested. "Better to approach him privately than at his office where others might overhear." The boarding house was just opening as they arrived, the smell of fresh coffee and baking bread filling the air. They secured a table in the corner and ordered breakfast, both men exhausted but too keyed up to consider rest. An hour later, Marshal Calloway entered a tall, imposing figure with a salt and pepper mustache and the weathered face of a man who had seen his share of frontier justice. Morgan caught his eye and gestured him over, making a brief introduction before allowing Kane to explain his situation. Calloway listened without interruption, examining the letters with a critical eye. When Kane finished, the marshal leaned back in his chair, considering. "These are serious accusations against prominent men," he said finally. "But these letters, if authentic, they're compelling evidence." "They're authentic," Kane assured him. Wells' former partner had no reason to lie on his deathbed. Calloway nodded slowly. "I've had concerns about Judge Parker's rulings for some time. Too many decisions favoring certain interests, too many convenient interpretations of the law." He tapped the letters thoughtfully. "This may be the key to a larger investigation." "What happens now?" Morgan asked. "I'll need to wire the federal marshal's office in Sacramento," Calloway explained. "This crosses jurisdiction lines and involves elected officials." "In the meantime," he turned to Kane, "you'll stay under my protection. Wells has friends in Carson City too, and I wouldn't put it past him to extend his reach here." Kane felt a weight lift from his shoulders. After 5 years of carrying his burden alone, of being hunted and vilified, someone in authority was finally listening. But even as relief washed over him, his thoughts returned to Clara, alone in Truckee. "There's someone in danger back in Truckee," he told the marshal. "Clara Thompson. She helped me, and Wells will know it by now." Calloway considered this. "I can't send men into another jurisdiction without cause, but I can wire Sheriff Donovan in Truckee, an old friend who retired last year. He might be willing to keep an eye on her until we sort this out." It wasn't ideal, but it was something. Kane provided Clara's details, and Calloway promised to send the wire immediately after breakfast. As the marshal left to begin the process of investigation, Kane turned to Morgan. "You should head back to Truckee. Your family will be worried and your business needs you." Morgan nodded reluctantly. "What about you?" "I'll stay here under the marshal's protection, see this through." Kane extended his hand. "Thank you, Morgan, for everything." As Morgan prepared to depart, Kane added, "If you can tell Clara I'm safe, tell her." He paused, searching for words adequate to express his feelings. "Tell her I'm coming back as soon as I can." The next few days passed in a blur of statements, telegrams, and growing anticipation. Marshal Calloway proved to be both thorough and discreet, building a case methodically, while keeping Kane's presence in Carson City as quiet as possible. Word came that federal marshals were being dispatched from Sacramento to assist with arrests, and that a circuit judge would oversee the case to ensure impartiality. Through it all, Kane's thoughts frequently returned to Clara. Calloway's friend in Truckee had sent word that she appeared safe, though Wells had indeed questioned her about Kane's whereabouts. According to the retired sheriff's report, Clara had handled the interrogation with dignity and revealed nothing useful. On the 4th day, as Kane was reviewing his statement one final time, Marshal Calloway entered with news. The federal marshals had arrived in Truckee before dawn and had arrested Mayor Wells, Judge Parker, and Sheriff Dawson. The evidence was overwhelming, particularly after Wells' home was searched and additional incriminating documents were discovered. "It's over," Calloway told him, satisfaction evident in his voice. "The federal prosecutor believes they'll all face substantial prison terms. Your name will be officially cleared within days." Kane should have felt triumph, or at least relief. Instead, he felt a strange emptiness, as if the drive that had sustained him for 5 years had suddenly evaporated. Only one thought filled the void: "I need to get back to Truckee." Calloway provided a horse and wished him well. Kane rode hard, pushing himself and his mount, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The journey that had taken a cautious night and day with Morgan was completed in less than a day's hard riding. As he approached Truckee, the sun was setting once more, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. The town seemed different somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted. People on the streets looked up as he rode past, recognition, and then something like awe crossing their faces. Word of Wells' arrest and Kane's vindication had clearly spread. But Kane had eyes for only one destination. He rode directly to Clara's house on the edge of town, his heart pounding as he dismounted and approached the door. Before he could knock, it opened, and she stood before him beautiful and real and somehow even more precious than in his memories. "You came back," she said simply. "I promised I would." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, 5 years of separation hanging between them. Then Clara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and Kane felt something inside him break and heal simultaneously. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Wells, Parker, Dawson, they're all arrested. The evidence was even stronger than I thought. My name will be cleared officially within days." Clara pulled back to look at his face, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And then what happens, Kane Zimmerman? Where will you go when you're a free man again?" Kane reached up to touch her face gently, tracing the line of her cheekbone with his thumb. "For 5 years I told myself I was staying away to protect you, that you deserved better than a man with a price on his head and hatred in his heart. And now," she whispered, "now I know better. I know that running from love is just another kind of prison." He took a deep breath. "If you'll have me, Clara Thompson, I'd like to stay right here, to build a life with you, the one we planned before everything went wrong." Clara's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with 5 years of longing and faith and patience rewarded. When they finally parted, both breathless, Clara smiled a radiant, joyful smile that Kane had feared he might never see again. "I think," she said softly, "that can be arranged." In the days that followed, Kane's name was officially cleared. The federal investigation revealed the full extent of Wells' corruption, including embezzlement of town funds, land fraud, and intimidation of business owners and ranchers throughout the region. Many citizens of Truckee came forward with their own stories of Wells' misdeeds, painting a picture of a town that had been under the thumb of corruption for years. To Kane's surprise, he was approached by a committee of town elders, including Reverend Adams, with an unexpected offer: to stand for election as the new sheriff of Truckee. The position would be temporary at first, until a special election could be held, but their support was unanimous. "The town needs healing," Reverend Adams explained. "It needs someone who understands justice, who has experienced injustice firsthand, someone who can help rebuild trust." Kane was hesitant at first. "The last time I wore a badge in this town, it didn't end well." "All the more reason why it should be you who wears one again," the Reverend replied. "Redemption works both ways, my friend. The town needs to redeem itself as much as you needed to clear your name." After discussing it with Clara, Kane accepted the position. His first official act was to appoint Morgan's son James as his deputy, a bright young man eager to serve his community honorably. Clara, meanwhile, had her own plans. With Wells' corrupt influence removed, she was able to secure a loan to expand her father's property into a proper ranch. She had always had a head for business, and with Kane by her side, they began to build something meaningful together. A month after Kane's return, on a perfect summer evening, they were married in Reverend Adams' church. The same townsfolk who had once been willing to believe the worst of Kane now filled the pews to witness his happiness. Clara wore a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Kane thought she had never looked more beautiful. As they exchanged vows, Kane felt the last of his bitterness dissolve. The years of exile had changed him, hardened him in some ways, but Clara's unwavering faith had preserved the best parts of him, the capacity for love, for forgiveness, for hope. After the ceremony, they walked together to the riverbank where they had reunited. The water flowed clear and steady, catching the golden light of the setting sun. "I have something for you," Clara said, reaching into a small pocket in her dress. She pulled out a smooth river stone, placing it in Kane's palm. "The last one. I didn't throw it in the day you returned. I saved it for today." Kane closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its weight and solidity. 5 years of waiting. 2,000 stones. "I don't know if I deserved such faith, Clara." She smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "Love isn't about deserving, Kane. It's about choosing. Every day I chose to believe in you, to wait for you, and I would have waited 2,000 more days if necessary." Together, they tossed the final stone into the river, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the water. As they stood hand in hand, the past receded like those ripples, and the future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility. 1 year later, on another summer evening, Kane and Clara sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Clara held their 2-month-old son, William, named for her father, while Kane rocked gently in a chair he had crafted himself during the winter months. The past year had brought challenges rebuilding the ranch, establishing Kane's authority as sheriff, helping the town recover from Wells' corrupt influence. But it had also brought immeasurable joy. Kane had found purpose in his work, satisfaction in building a home with Clara, and unexpected delight in fatherhood. The town of Truckee was healing too. New businesses had opened, free from the extortion that had plagued them under Wells' regime. The railroad had brought prosperity that was now more equitably shared. And Kane had established a reputation for fair-minded justice that had earned him a full term as sheriff in the special election. "Penny for your thoughts," Clara said, shifting William to her shoulder as he dozed. Kane smiled, reaching over to gently stroke his son's downy head. "I was just thinking how different everything is from what I expected when I rode back into town that day. I came for justice, not knowing if I would even survive to see it done." "And instead, you found a family," Clara finished for him. "A family, a home, a purpose." Kane took her free hand in his, rubbing his thumb over her wedding band. "Sometimes I wake up in the night and listen to you breathing beside me, just to convince myself it's real." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. "The nightmares are getting less frequent, though." Kane nodded. There had been dark moments, especially in the beginning nights when he would wake in a cold sweat, convinced he was still on the run, or reliving the night he was nearly lynched. But Clara's steady presence, her unwavering support, had helped heal those wounds. "I had a letter from Marshal Calloway today," Kane said after a moment. "Wells and Parker have been sentenced, 20 years each in federal prison." "Justice at last," Clara murmured. "Justice," Kane agreed. "Though sometimes I think the real justice is this, that despite everything they tried to take from us, we found our way back to each other. That we're building the life we always wanted." William stirred against Clara's shoulder, making small sounds of contentment. She adjusted him gently, pressing a kiss to his head. "And a new life besides." Kane rose from his chair, moving to sit beside Clara on the porch swing. He draped his arm around her shoulders, drawing his family close as the last rays of sunlight painted the valley in gold. "Do you still go to the river?" he asked softly. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Sometimes. Not to throw stones anymore, just to remember how far we've come." "Let's go tomorrow," Kane suggested. "All 3 of us. William should know the place where his parents' story turned around." Clara smiled up at him, her eyes filled with the same steady light that had guided him home. "I'd like that." As darkness fell over Truckee, stars appeared one by one in the vast western sky. On the porch of their home, Kane Zimmerman held his wife and child close, marveling at how a journey that had begun with revenge and bitterness had transformed into one of love and redemption. The river would continue to flow. The seasons would change. Children would grow. But some things would remain constant, the mountains standing guard over the valley, the community rebuilding itself day by day, and the love between a man and a woman who had found each other despite all odds. Kane had returned to the town that betrayed him seeking justice. Instead, by the river where Clara had faithfully waited, he had found something far more precious: forgiveness, purpose, and the courage to love again. As the evening deepened into night, Kane whispered against Clara's hair, "Thank you for waiting." Her answer was simple and true, echoing across 5 years of separation and a lifetime of promise. "I always knew you'd come back." And in that moment, under a canopy of stars with his family in his arms, Kane Zimmerman was finally, completely home. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to Kane and Clara Zimmerman. Their ranch prospered, expanding to include cattle and horses that were sought after throughout Nevada and California. Their family grew as well. William was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, Joseph. Kane served as sheriff for 8 years, helping to transform Truckee into a model of frontier law and order. When he finally decided to step down, passing the badge to his trusted deputy James Morgan, the entire town gathered to honor his service. The celebration was a far cry from the suspicion and hatred that had driven him from Truckee years before. Clara's business acumen proved to be a perfect complement to Kane's practical ranching skills. She established connections with merchants in Sacramento and San Francisco, ensuring their ranch products commanded premium prices. When the territorial legislature began considering women's suffrage, Clara became an outspoken advocate, traveling to Carson City to testify about women's contributions to Nevada's growth and prosperity. Their children grew strong and capable in the mountain air, learning the values their parents held dear: honesty, hard work, and the courage to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. William showed an early aptitude for ranching, while Elizabeth inherited her mother's sharp mind for business. Young Joseph, the most introspective of the three, developed a love for books and learning that led him toward a future in law. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Truckee changed as well. The railroad brought more settlers, more businesses, more connections to the wider world. Kane and Clara adapted to these changes while maintaining the core of what made their life together special. On warm summer evenings, they still occasionally walked down to the river where Clara had waited so faithfully. Sometimes they went alone, sometimes with their children or, later, grandchildren. It became a family tradition to skip stones across the water, though only Kane and Clara fully understood the significance of the gesture. "Each stone represents a day," Clara would tell the children. "A day of faith that what you love will return to you." On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire town gathered to celebrate the couple whose love story had become something of a local legend. Young people who hadn't even been born, when Kane returned to clear his name, knew the tale of the falsely accused deputy and the woman who had waited by the river, casting a stone each day until he returned. That evening, after the celebration, Kane and Clara slipped away to their special spot by the river. The sunset painted the water gold, just as it had on the day of his return. Though they were older now, Kane's dark hair streaked with silver, fine lines around Clara's still beautiful eyes, the love between them had only deepened with time. 25 years, Kane marveled, holding Clara's hand as they stood at the water's edge. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode back into town. Other times, it seems like another lifetime entirely." Clara squeezed his hand. "Both are true, I think. The man who left and the man who returned were different in many ways. Just as the woman who waited became someone new in the waiting. Kane turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I've never asked you this, but was there ever a moment when you thought about giving up? About not coming to the river, about not throwing that day's stone?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Once," she admitted. "About 3 years after you left. There was a terrible winter storm, and I had been ill with fever for days. I remember waking as the sun was setting, knowing I should go to the river, and thinking how easy it would be to just stay in my warm bed, to tell myself that one day wouldn't matter." "What made you go?" A smile touched her lips. "I remembered something my father once told me. That true faith isn't tested when it's easy, but when it's almost impossible to hold on. So I wrapped myself in blankets and trudged through the snow to the river. The stone was so cold it nearly stuck to my fingers, but I threw it anyway." Kane brought her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. "I spent 5 years convinced I was alone in the world, that no one was waiting, that no one believed in me. If I had known. If you had known, you might not have fought so hard to clear your name," Clara pointed out gently. "Everything happened as it needed to happen, Kane. Even the hard parts, even the years apart." As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the water, Kane and Clara Zimmerman stood together in the gathering twilight, two people who had weathered betrayal, separation, and hardship, and emerged stronger for it. "I love you, Clara," Kane said simply. "More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, her voice as steady and true as it had been when she first welcomed him home. "Always and completely." They walked back to their home hand in hand, their footsteps in perfect unison after 25 years of walking through life together. Behind them, the river continued its eternal journey, carrying away the past and bringing new possibilities with each flowing moment. The story of Kane and Clara Zimmerman became part of Truckee's heritage, a reminder that love, faith, and justice could triumph even in the darkest times. Long after they were gone, new generations would hear about the deputy who returned to the town that betrayed him, and the woman he found still waiting by the river, a testament to the enduring power of unwavering belief in someone worth waiting for. And in the quiet evenings, if you stood by the banks of the Truckee River, as the sun set over the Sierra Nevada mountains, you might imagine you could see them still, a tall, strong man and a graceful, determined woman, walking together along the riverbank. Their love as constant as the flow of the water and as enduring as the mountains themselves.